Otis Redding turned on the radio. A familiar melody was playing, his own song. But something was wrong. The voice was different. The words were different. And the message was aimed directly at him. It was the summer of 1967. And Aretha Franklin had just done something nobody in the music business could have predicted. She had taken a song that belonged to Otis Redding. A song he had written, recorded, and performed as a declaration of a man's need. And she had turned it inside out. She had flipped every word, every intention, every ounce of meaning, and pointed it like a loaded weapon at the world that had kept black women silent for too long. And in doing so, she had accidentally started a war. Not a war of violence, but a war of souls. A war that would reshape American music in ways nobody could measure at the time. But before we get to that moment in the car, before we get to Aretha and what she did and why she did it, we have to go back. We have to go all the way back to a boy in Dawson, Georgia, who sang so loud in church that the walls shook. Because that is where this story truly begins. Have you ever felt something so deeply that the only way to release it was to scream? Not in anger, not in pain, but in pure, overwhelming feeling that had no other exit. That is what Otis Redding felt every single time he opened his mouth to sing. That raw, uncontainable human feeling is the thing that would make him a legend. And the very thing that would make Aretha Franklin's act of musical defiance so much more than just a cover version. Otis Ray Redding Jr. was born on September 9, 1941 in Dawson, Georgia, the second of 6 children in a family that had very little of anything except faith and music. His father, Otis Sr., worked as a sharecropper and later as a janitor, and he sang in the church choir with a voice that people in Macon still talked about decades later. His mother, Fannie Mae, kept the household together with a quiet, immovable strength. They were not poor in the way that breaks people. They were poor in the way that teaches people. And what young Otis learned, growing up in segregated Georgia in the late 1940s and early 1950s, was that music was the one thing nobody could take from you. The church was everything. First Baptist Church of Macon, Georgia. Otis would sit in those wooden pews every Sunday and listen to the congregation sing. And something would happen inside him that he could never quite explain in words. The voices would rise together, and the air itself seemed to change. He started singing in the youth choir when he was 9 years old. By the time he was 12, people were coming to church specifically to hear the Redding boy sing. Not to hear the sermon, not to hear the choir, to hear him. But Georgia in the 1950s was not a place where a black boy with a voice could simply walk into greatness. There were walls everywhere. Walls you could not see but felt every single day. Walls that told you which water fountain to drink from, which schools you could attend, which dreams were permitted. Otis watched his father work himself to the bone for wages that would never be enough, and he made himself a private promise. He would find another way. He only knew it had something to do with the sound that came out of his chest when he sang. He started playing guitar as a teenager, teaching himself by listening to records. Little Richard was everything to Otis in those years. That wild, impossible energy. That voice that seemed to come from beyond ordinary human experience. He would enter local talent contests and win them, collecting small prize money that helped his family buy groceries. He was not performing for fame. He was performing to survive. But even in those small Macon clubs and community halls, people would stop what they were doing when Otis sang. There was something in his voice that demanded your full attention. Not because it was perfect, because it was real. He dropped out of high school to pursue music full-time and joined a band called the Pinetoppers. They played wherever they could get a booking. Small clubs, roadhouses, church socials, anywhere that would have them. The money was inconsistent and the conditions brutal, especially for black musicians touring the Deep South in the late 1950s. There were nights when they were refused service at restaurants after performing to white audiences who had cheered for hours. Otis absorbed all of it. He did not harden against it. He absorbed it and turned it into fuel. The break came in 1962, and it came in the most unexpected way. Otis had driven a fellow musician named Johnny Jenkins to Stax Records in Memphis, Tennessee, purely as a favor. He was the driver. He was nobody that day. But when the recording session finished early, someone noticed the young man sitting quietly in the corner with a song in his head, and they gave him 15 minutes. Just 15 minutes to prove himself or go home. Otis Redding walked up to that microphone in 15 borrowed minutes and recorded a song called These Arms of Mine. It was slow. It was aching. It was the sound of someone reaching across an impossible distance toward something they were not sure they would ever reach. The room went very still when he sang it. The engineers looked at each other. Jim Stewart, the founder of Stax Records, walked out of his office to find out what was happening. By the time Otis finished, there was no question. This was not a favor. This was an arrival. These Arms of Mine climbed the rhythm and blues charts with the steady, unstoppable momentum of something inevitable. It was not a flashy hit. It did not explode overnight. It seeped into people the way the best soul music always does, finding the cracks in your defenses and settling in. Radio stations in the South started getting calls. Who is this? Who is singing this? And what they found, when they came to see Otis Redding perform live, was something they had not been prepared for. Because the records were emotional, yes. But live, Otis Redding was a physical force. He stood 6 feet tall and moved across the stage like he was trying to reach every single person in the room individually. He would drop to his knees. He would grip the microphone stand like it was the only thing keeping him from flying apart. He screamed and whispered and pleaded and demanded in the same breath. There was no distance between Otis Redding and his audience. He refused to allow it. By 1965, Otis was a significant figure in the world of rhythm and blues, but still largely a regional phenomenon. The mainstream audience had not yet found him. That was about to change. But first, there was the matter of a song he wrote that spring. A song he had no idea would one day be taken from him and transformed into something that would outlive them both. In the spring of 1965, Otis Redding sat down and wrote Respect. A man comes home after working hard all day and asks his woman for one thing. Just one thing. Respect. The song was direct and driving, with a horn arrangement that hit like a fist and a vocal performance that made it clear Otis was not requesting, he was demanding. It was a good song. A solid song. He had written many of those. He had absolutely no idea what was coming. Aretha Louise Franklin was born on March 25, 1942, in Memphis, Tennessee, but she was a Detroit girl in her soul. Her father, Reverend Clarence LaVaughn Franklin, was one of the most famous Baptist preachers in America, a man whose sermons were commercially recorded and sold across the country. His church, New Bethel Baptist in Detroit, was a gathering place for civil rights leaders and musicians, and anyone who needed to be reminded that the human spirit was stronger than the forces trying to crush it. Martin Luther King Jr. was a family friend. Mahalia Jackson sang in that church. Aretha grew up surrounded by greatness and trained by it without even realizing what was happening. She was playing piano by ear at age 8. By 10, she was singing in her father's church in a way that made grown adults weep. And through all of it, through every note she sang, every sermon she heard her father deliver about dignity and the unbreakable worth of every human being, something was building inside Aretha Franklin that had no name yet, but it would find one in a recording studio in New York City in 1967. Aretha's early career at Columbia Records had been frustrating in the way that only truly gifted artists can be frustrated. When they know exactly what they are capable of, and nobody around them will let them do it. Columbia had tried to make her into a pop singer, a jazz singer, a cabaret performer. She had made respectable records that sold modestly and felt, to Aretha, like wearing clothes that did not fit. Not badly tailored, just wrong. In 1966, she signed with Atlantic Records, and producer Jerry Wexler took her to Muscle Shoals, Alabama, sat her down at the piano, and told her to play what she felt. And what came out of Aretha Franklin in those sessions was not manufactured. It was released. The way a dam releases water that has been building for years, and the power of it was almost frightening. Her first Atlantic single-hit radio stations and the calls flooded in immediately. Not who is this, but what is this? Because people recognized something in Aretha's voice that they had not heard quite that way before. It was not just talent. It was truth. It was the sound of a woman who had spent years being told how to sound, finally sounding like herself. And then she heard Respect. The story of how Aretha came to record Respect has several versions, and the truth probably lies somewhere between all of them. What is known as this: Aretha heard Otis Redding's version and understood something about it immediately that Otis himself had not intended. She heard a man demanding what he felt he deserved from a woman. And she thought, what if the woman answered? But here is the part that most people do not know. The part that turns the story from a clever artistic decision into something much more complicated and much more human. Aretha and Otis had met. Not just in passing. They had shared stages, shared conversations, shared the specific experience of being black artists in an America that wanted their talent without wanting their dignity. And in those encounters, something had happened. A moment, an exchange, a tension that those who witnessed it described in different ways, but which all agree left Aretha with something unresolved. Not hatred, nothing so simple, more like a question that had been asked and never properly answered. And Aretha, being Aretha, decided to answer it in the only language she truly owned. She rearranged the song completely. She rewrote the bridge. She added the now famous repeated spelling of the title, R-E-S-P-E-C-T, which her sisters Carolyn and Irma helped develop in the studio, turning a demand into a declaration. She took Otis's song about what a man wants and transformed it into something so much larger than a domestic conversation. She made it about what every woman wanted, what every black woman wanted, what every person who had ever been treated as less than fully human wanted. She took the personal and made it universal without losing a single drop of its heat. The recording session was electric. Everyone in the studio knew they were witnessing something significant. When they finished, Jerry Wexler listened to the playback and sat quietly for a long moment. Then he said, very simply, that is the one. That is it. Respect was released in April of 1967 and hit the world like a weather event. It went to #1 on the rhythm and blues charts and #1 on the pop charts simultaneously. It was on every radio station, in every home, in every car. It became the unofficial anthem of the civil rights movement, of the feminist movement, of anyone anywhere who had ever felt overlooked and was done pretending to be fine with it. Aretha Franklin became, in a matter of weeks, not just a successful recording artist, but a symbol, the Queen of Soul, and Otis Redding turned on his car radio and heard his song. He pulled over to the side of the road. He sat there in the Georgia heat and he listened, all the way through. When it ended, he did not immediately get out of the car. He sat. And then, according to the people who were with him that day, he started to laugh. Not a bitter laugh. Not the laugh of a man who felt robbed. The people who were there, his manager, a musician friend, both said later that it was the laugh of someone who had just understood something important, something that the song had always contained, but that he had not fully seen until Aretha showed it to him. "What," he said, pulling back onto the road. "Was this, she done got it right. That woman got it completely right, and I got to figure out what to do about that." What he did was extraordinary. At his very next concert, Otis Redding performed Respect, but he performed Aretha Franklin's version. He stood on that stage and sang the woman's version of his own song. He spelled out the letters. He changed the pronouns. He gave the song back to Aretha, publicly, in front of his own audience, in a gesture that nobody in the music business could quite believe. The crowd was confused at first, then astonished, then they understood what they were watching. A man who could have been angry, who had every conventional reason to be territorial, was instead standing on a stage and saying she improved it. "She made it bigger than I could, and I am honoring that." Those who knew Otis well were not entirely surprised. He was not a small man in spirit. He had grown up in a tradition, the gospel tradition, the soul tradition, where music did not belong to anyone, where a song was a vessel that the right voice could fill, and that a different voice could fill differently, and both fillings could be true. When Aretha did what she did, his first response was not possession but recognition. But privately, it shook something loose in him, because Aretha's version had done something that his version had not. It had crossed over. It had reached the white mainstream audience in a way that Otis, despite his extraordinary talent, had not yet fully managed. And this created a pressure in him that he would spend the next months grappling with. He had a conversation around this time with Steve Cropper, his closest creative collaborator at Stax, that Cropper has talked about only rarely and always with careful reverence. Otis told him that he felt like he had been singing to one room his whole career, and there was a whole other room he had never walked into, not because he was not allowed, because he had not trusted himself to walk in. Aretha had walked in wearing nothing but herself, and the room had stood up. Then, just weeks later, Otis walked into the biggest room of his life. It was June 17, 1967, the Monterey Pop Festival in Monterey, California. 3 days of music that would change the shape of popular culture. The festival's lineup was overwhelmingly white in its musical character: rock and roll, psychedelic rock, folk rock. The counterculture had built its own church, and it was not entirely sure whether there was room for a black man from Macon, Georgia, who sang soul music. Otis Redding took the stage on Sunday night and looked out at an audience that barely knew who he was. He stood there for a moment, just looking at them, and then he said something that has been quoted many times since but still lands the same every time you hear it. He said, "I have been told this is the love crowd, and I believe it. So let me hear you say love." The crowd said love, and then Otis opened his mouth and everything else stopped. He played for 45 minutes. What happened in those 45 minutes is the subject of testimony from people who were there, people who have spent decades trying to find the right words for it and mostly failing. He did not condescend to that audience. He did not try to speak their language or adjust himself toward them. He brought himself to them completely, without translation, and they came to meet him. He dropped to one knee during Try a Little Tenderness, and 60,000 people lost their collective minds. By the end, an audience that had come mostly to see rock bands was on its feet, weeping and screaming and reaching toward the stage in a way that had nothing to do with celebrity and everything to do with being in the presence of someone singing something true. Otis, coming off stage after that performance, drenched and exhilarated, stood in the wings for a moment. Just stood there, breathing. Someone handed him a towel, and he stood there with the towel in his hand, and he looked at the crew around him, and he said quietly, "I did not know they could feel it. I thought it was just for us." I did not know they could feel it too. He was 25 years old. He had just played the greatest concert of his career. He had just discovered something about the reach of what he carried that changed everything he thought he knew about the walls between people. He would live for exactly 6 more months, and then something happened that nobody expected. In those final months, something shifted in Otis Redding. He was softer in his new material, more reflective, less relentless. As if the conversation with Aretha and the revelation at Monterey had opened a door inside him that he was only now beginning to walk through. It was December of 1967, and Otis had a few days between tour dates. He went to a houseboat on Lake Monona in Madison, Wisconsin to rest and write. He sat by the water in the cold December air, and he felt something he had not felt in a long time. He felt still. All the motion, all the performing. All the noise of his life had gone quiet for a moment, and in that quiet, he reached for a guitar and started to play something he had been carrying in the back of his mind for months. The melody was slow and patient. The words came out of the water and the cold and the particular loneliness of being far from home, with no place specific to put that longing. He wrote about sitting on the dock, about watching the ships come in, about wasting time, about being a man who had traveled so far and so fast that he had somehow lost track of the direction home. He sang it quietly, just to himself, and it felt like the truest thing he had ever written. He took the song to Stax and recorded it in a single session. The arrangement was spare by the standards of soul music. No shouting horns, no relentless rhythm. Just a simple guitar figure, the quiet wash of strings, and his voice doing something it had never quite done in a recording studio before. Being gentle. Not weak. Never weak. But gentle in the way of someone who has stopped proving something and started simply speaking. Steve Cropper sat at the console and listened and did not say a word for a long time after the take was finished. What he felt in that recording, he said later, was a man arriving somewhere, not at the end of something, at the beginning. There was a moment at the end where Otis improvised a wordless outro, not the planned ending, just sounds that came out of him in the quiet of the studio. Da-da-da-da, whistling into the silence. It was spontaneous and strange and entirely him. They kept it. Otis told Steve Cropper the song was not finished. There were still things he wanted to change. Cropper finished the arrangement after the accident, working from what Otis had left behind, trying to honor what he heard in it, without adding anything that did not belong. It was the most difficult creative act of Cropper's life. Otis Redding died on December 10, 1967. He was 26 years old. Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay was released in January of 1968. It went to number 1 in America, the first posthumous number 1 single in the history of the Billboard Hot 100 chart. It was the first time a soul song had crossed over completely, sitting at the top of the pop charts without compromise or calculation. Everything Otis had been reaching toward in those final months had arrived. Just too late for him to see it. The music world received the news of his death with a grief that was disorienting in its scale. It was not just the loss of a great performer. It was the loss of someone in the middle of becoming something even more extraordinary. You could hear it in Dock of the Bay. You could hear the door he had been approaching, left open with nobody walking through it. Aretha Franklin heard the news in New York City. She did not speak publicly in those first hours. She went home, closed the door, and sat at her piano. Those who knew her said the grief was particular, not the grief of a rival. The grief of someone who had been in conversation with another person, and now the conversation was over before it was finished. There was a private memorial service for Otis, a small gathering of musicians and close collaborators, where Aretha Franklin sang. She chose a gospel song from the tradition that had raised them both. She sang with the full force of everything she was, and when she finished the room was completely silent. Steve Cropper was there. He was standing near the back. And he saw what happened after Aretha finished singing. She turned away from the gathering, just for a moment, and she put her hand against the wall, not to hold herself up, just to touch something solid. And she stood there with her hand on the wall and her eyes closed, and she said something so quietly that Cropper could barely hear it. He said later that he was not certain he should repeat it. But when pressed decades later, he did. He said Aretha had whispered, "I was not done talking to you." He kept that to himself for 30 years. 30 years of interviews and documentaries about both Aretha and Otis, and Steve Cropper kept that moment to himself because he felt it belonged to her. He shared it finally in the late 1990s, when enough time had passed that it felt like history rather than privacy. And when people heard it, they understood something about the relationship between those two artists that all the music had been pointing toward all along. It was not rivalry. It had never truly been rivalry. It was conversation. It was two extraordinary people shaped by the same tradition, responding to each other across the distance of their different experiences, using the only language big enough to hold all of it. Soul music. The music that had come out of the church and the fields and been made, by artists like Otis and Aretha, into something that reached everyone. When Aretha took Respect and remade it, she was not destroying Otis, she was answering him. And when Otis stood on that stage and sang her version back to the world, he was completing a call and response that had been going on since they first shared a stage. It was the oldest form in gospel music. One voice calls, another answers, and together they make something neither could make alone. Otis Redding's influence on soul music, on rock and roll, on every genre that values emotional authenticity over technical perfection, is impossible to overstate. His recordings at Stax, his extraordinary live performances, his songs, Try a Little Tenderness, I've Been Loving You Too Long, Mr. Pitiful, and Dock of the Bay, form a body of work that has never sounded dated, because it was never about a moment. It was about something permanent, the need to be heard, the need to reach across whatever distance exists between one human being and another and say, I am here, and what I feel is real, and you can feel it too if you let yourself. Aretha Franklin carried her version of Respect for the rest of her life. She performed it at the inauguration of President Barack Obama. Every time, no matter how many times the audience had heard it, the song hit like something new. Because Aretha never performed it as nostalgia. She performed it as if the need for it was still alive, because it was, because it always is. In 2018, when Aretha Franklin died, among all the tributes, one phrase came up again and again. She sang like she knew what you needed to hear. Not what you wanted, what you needed. That is also what people said about Otis. They were two sides of the same immense truth. And the conversation between them started in recording studios and continued on stages and completed in a private moment with a hand on a wall and 6 whispered words, is one of the greatest conversations in the history of American music. Respect began as one man's demand and became every person's declaration. Dock of the Bay began in the quiet of a cold lake in December and became a song about the peace that comes when you stop fighting your own nature and simply allow yourself to be still. Both songs are still being discovered by people who were not yet born when they were recorded. That is the measure of them. Not the charts, not the awards, not the records sold, but the fact that a teenager somewhere in the world is hearing these songs for the first time today, and something is opening up inside them, Some room they did not know was there. Otis Redding sang like his soul was on fire. He burned brightly and briefly and left a light that has not dimmed in 60 years. Some voices do not end. They just become the air. If this story of courage, soul, and the extraordinary conversation between two of music's greatest voices moved you, subscribe and hit the like button. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that some lights are too important to keep hidden. And ring that notification bell for more untold stories about the legends who changed music forever.